Okay, you can start when you're ready, Ashish.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, especially to Professor Villia for hosting this session. My sincere gratitude to Kids Research Network. It's great to be part of this community as well. Now, this is a small part of my PhD dissertation that I submitted last year to BITS Pilani Goa campus, where I finished my PhD in December 2023, after which I joined Azim Premji University, Bhopal as an assistant professor, where I'm currently working. So my PhD dissertation looked at women's cricket and football histories in India, especially during the period 1970s to 1990s. I will explain the significance of this period a little later in this session. Uh, so this was part of one of the chapters of my dissertation, where I undertook a feminist historiography of women's cricket in India. I begin this chapter with a review of men's cricket history, and I observed the exalted status reserved to men's cricket. I looked at various arguments regarding how cricket is decolonized in India, especially by scholars like Arjuna Padurai, by Boria Majumdar, who looked at men's cricket histories, men's cricket, the present and past of men's cricket, and argued that cricket is truly a decolonized sport in India. It's the colonial hangover is there, not there anymore in cricket. So these kind of arguments is something that I initially reviewed in my chapter in my dissertation, and I looked and I observed that none of those observations, none of those analysis actually looked into women's cricket history in India, and this I find as an avenue, a possible avenue to understand how a sport can be decolonized using the analysis of women's sport. So I argue that the reluctance to engage more critically with the masculine ideology of at the heart of the game has contributed to women's cricket being understudied in academia. Uh, to this end, women's cricket historiography, I argue, is an urgent necessity in two key ways. First, women's cricket histories can illuminate the sport's colonial tendencies in a post-colonial society and seek to address these systemic deficiencies. Second, invisibilizing women's cricket history from historical explorations of cricket results in reinforcing the colonial construction of cricket as a masculine entity. An adequate focus on women's cricket history, illuminating the resistance and defiance of women cricketers against the patriarchal system that worked against them, aids women's sport in reclaiming its deserved place in the annals of sport history. These illuminations are not constrained as surface level dissonances, but they seek to challenge and thwart ideological underpinnings that apportion a central and ubiquitous role to masculinity in sport. This argument inaugurates the section on women's cricket historiography. The focus of this section is on the history of women's cricket during 1973 to 1991. I will explain the significance of this particular period a little later. However, I start with a brief overview of women's cricket in the colonial period. This picture is something of great significance. Again, I'll come to this picture a little later. This is Chanda Rangaswamy and Diana Adalji, two former Indian internationals. They are both captains of Indian cricket team during the 70s, 80s period as well. The historical exploration in this chapter is supported by the inclusion of archived data collected during my visit to Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi, and by gathering information from newspaper archives accessed through historical newspaper section of ProQuest, Internet Archives, Australian Web Archive Trove, and newspaper archive section of Google. Furthermore, the information presented here is supported by a range of academic and non-academic articles, including an autobiographical account in the form of a book chapter entitled The Journey of Indian Women's Cricket from the 1970s by former Indian captain Shanda Rangaswamy and other published interviews of former players. I also sourced some photos and information from the Facebook group Indian Women's Cricket History. The first, like, coming to the history of women's cricket in colonial India, it was in 1886 that the first recorded instance of a cricket match involving female players happened. The Times of India records that the exhibition match was played between a ladies' team and a men's team in Shimla. Now, this match had curious rules. The rules were that the male players could not bowl with their strong arm. They had to bowl with their weaker hand. They could field with their weaker hand. And instead of using cricket bats, the male players only could use broomsticks to play, etc. Likewise, in Bangalore in 1894, Barakpur in 1896, Nagpur in 1899, such matches were played, all of them with these curious, peculiar rules. And these matches only involved British players, players of British origin. And it was in 1917 that the first match that involved Indian female players happened. The Bombay Chronicles report on a match played in 1917 between Parsi men's and women's team reveals that the peculiar rules implemented during the mixed gender match uh, played by the British were also followed by the Parsi players. Now, if you look at the men's cricket history, Parsi community played a huge role in popularizing men's cricket in India. They were one of the first patrons of the sport, conducting tours to England. They popularized the game in India, and likewise, they were the first to adopt to women's cricket as well. In 1934, the Bombay Chronicle reported an interesting development in Indian women's cricket. Under the aegis of Indian Women's Athletic Union of Calcutta, a cricket tour to England was proposed in 1934. The report observes that this idea caused a stir in Bombay, where many were skeptical about the quality of cricket and available talent for such a tour. The report of this tour was also covered in British newspapers like Daily News and Reynolds newspaper. This tour, however, did not materialize. It was suspected that this tour did not go through because there was not enough financial funds. But in 1937, the organization found a sponsor in Maharaja of Sandosh. Maharaja of Sandosh was a princely patron who was very much into sports. Now, the current interstate football senior men's football tournament in India is called Sandosh Trophy, after Maharaja of Santosh. So he was the sponsor of this particular tour. But for reasons unknown, the 1937 tour also did not materialize. Around the same time in Bombay, the Khar Gymkhana organized cricket matches featuring female players. The Times of India suggests that conservative Indian women were dragged out to play a cricket match against the stronger sex, verbatim from the report. The Khar Gymkhana conducted a mixed cricket match in 1937, drawing in attendance of more than 1,500 at the time. The report also observed that some of the Indian ladies played in shorts and trousers, while the precise details of what the men's attire was not mentioned. Now, this also has a historical context, as most of you would know that during the 1920s, 30s, till even 1990s, England and Australia, Australian women's players, they played in skirts instead of trousers. So this particularly get a mention in this report because a lot of players wore trousers and shorts playing cricket at this time. The sporadic instances of these matches suggest that women's cricket in India lacked a stable foundation in the colonial era. There are no documented records of any tournaments involving women's cricket teams prior to India's independence in 1947. Meanwhile, the Bombay Hockey Association took the initiative to organize women's field hockey tournaments starting from 1935. The tournament was called Killadar Cup. There were 4 different tournaments that happened in Bombay Gymkhana at the time. Women's cricket tournaments, however, did not take place until the 1970s. J.C. Moitra, the sports editor of Bombay Chronicle in the 1940s, he dismisses these cricket matches as a mockery. Indian women's cricket started in earnest in the 1970s. The women's cricket club, the first women's cricket club in India was named Albies. It was set up in 1971 by a Parsi woman named Anu Bamji and her husband. Bamji, based in Bombay, sought to form a cricket association for the women in the city. In 1973, the first women's nationals were held in Pune in April. It had 2.5 teams participating in the tournament. 2.5 because there was a Bombay team, there was a Maharashtra team, and there was an Uttar Pradesh team which did not have a quota of 11 players. So they had to borrow from the other 2 teams to fill up 11 players. So that's why the tournament was called a 2.5 team tournament. The UP team's participation was courtesy of a man called Mahendra Kumar Sharma. Before the tournament, he hired a loudspeaker and went around the city announcing that there will be cricket matches for girls. Do come to watch. This is perhaps the first promotional event associated with a women's cricket match in India as well. In 1975, Mahendra Kumar Sharma formed WCAI, Women's Cricket Association of India, and he was its first general secretary as well. Now, this is from 1973. That's a photo from that I got in the Indian Women's Cricket History Facebook page. This is the winning captain getting the award from the chief guest. By the time the second edition of the tournament in December came around in December in 1973, the number of teams had increased from two and a half to uh, 2.5 to 8. This proliferation was courtesy of an escalation in cricketing activities throughout major cities of the country, such as Bangalore, Madras, Calcutta, and others. Notably, during this phase, players like Susan Itticheria, Sudhash Shah, Shanda Rangaswamy emerged on the scene. 2 years later, India played their first international series. The year 1975 declared as International Year of Women, so active promotion of the women's game. Keshav and Patnaik state that Indian government of the day, headed by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, facing public criticism for imposing a state of emergency on the nation, so this opportunity to promote the women's games for some favorable PR. Now, this is something that I found in other sport as well. When I was doing my research on football, I spoke to one of the former footballers called Yolanda D'Souza. She was one of the key players of the Indian football team at that time. She mentioned the same thing, that Indira Gandhi was always available for both cricket and women's cricket and football players. And she saw this opportunity to sort of gain some favorable PR at a time where there was a lot of political instability in the country. The Indian team at the time was very young, and upon learning this, the Australian brought in an under 23 squad. Newspaper The Age reported that Australia chose 2 or 3 players from each state to tour India, and players were asked to pay 800 Australian dollars to be part of the touring entourage, which comprised an unofficial side. The Australians would later use this caveat for declining official status for the India-Australia series, and the records of the series remained unofficial to this day. The series, however, was a huge success. Team manager Betty Butcher's account of the proceedings observes the ball-by-ball description on radio, extensive coverage in the print media, and matches filmed for the huge theatre audience. Such coverage would be the envy of every cricketing nation. Conservative estimates place the spectatorship of the series well over 1 lakh. The increase in ticket collection also helped the players, as they were offered better accommodation and other facilities as the tour progressed. Initially, they had to make with modest facilities, while the Australian players could stay in swanky hotels. The India-Australia series featured live commentary by All India Radio, India State Radio. According to a Times of India report, the commentators were reportedly confused on whether to describe the batter as batsman or batswoman, and used the term often interchangeably during the commentary. Rangaswamy claims that the golden year for Indian women's cricket team was 1976. After hosting New Zealand and West Indies on their home soil, the Indian women's team went on their first tour to New Zealand in December. First ever win for the Indian women's cricket team also came in 1976. These matches drew huge crowds. The win against West Indies came in front of a jubilant crowd in Patna, in excess of 25,000 at the time. India, alongside Australia, New Zealand, England, and West Indies, was one of the 5 test playing nations. In 1978, Mahendra Sharma seized the chance to host the second edition of the Women's World Cup in India. As well-intentioned and ambitious a move it was, it also turned out to be a logistical nightmare at different points during the tournament. The rivalry between state associations often proved detrimental and highlighted the long brewing issues that eventually culminated in Sharma resigning after the tournament. The tournament was fairly successful in terms of attendance and visibility, with crowds in excess of 40,000 turning up for matches, prompting Australian Cricket Council publicity manager Keith McGreedy to suggest that women's cricket has exploded in India and the media supports it to a hilt. This was quoted in the Australian Women's Weekly in 1979. However, the planning and organization was often found to be inefficient. The New Zealand cricket captain Pat McKelvey labelled the tournament as unsatisfactory and pointed out that flight and accommodation bookings were often messed up by the organizers, and there were instances where opponents were not turning up for certain matches. WCAI had to incur huge losses due to the conduct of the World Cup. and reportedly contributed to the General Secretary resigning. Sharma's resignation would ultimately prove to be damaging, as the following years witnessed Indian women's cricket struggle to maintain the momentum built during the 70s. Now, coming to the 80s, the 1980s, saw a significant decline in cricketing activities. The World Cup in 1978 also marked an end to the short apotheosis enjoyed by women's sport in India. Rangaswamy laments that, discounting the World Cup of 1982 and Australian Tour of 1984, little international cricket was played between 1978 and 1991. In the 1984 India-Australia series, they wore black armband to protest the non-payment of their allowances. I think the photo is right here. WCI Secretary Ashutosh Sharma admitted that the association was not rich enough yet to pay its players' allowances. The players' protests caught the attention of the general public. Then Chief Justice of India, Y.V. Chandrachud, questioned why the women's players were not financially compensated. They got no money at all at the time, while men's cricketers like Sunil Gavaskar and Kapil Dev were getting paid more than 10,000 per test match. However, 2 years later, the sports ministry downgraded the women's cricket to downgrade women's cricket to grade C, which meant that there was no government funding or allowances for women's cricket from then on. A report published in the Indian Express magazine in 1991 highlights the gender inequality that plagued the game of cricket in the country. The report states that, unlike men, the women can't even dream of earning a living by just playing cricket. This is quoted in a report by Bhatia in 1991 in Indian Express magazine. The report features excerpts from an interview with former captain Chandra Rangaswamy, who argues that it is not the quality of cricket that stilted the growth of women's cricket, but it is an overdose of men's cricket which has reduced interest in the women's game. Rangaswamy also accuses the media of reserving a stepmotherly treatment to women's cricket, as the media failed to give adequate attention to women's sport. One of the suggestions offered by Rangaswamy to rescue women's cricket from its ominous situation was to appoint women at the helm of WCAI. In 1994, women's cricket in India was on the path of recovery. This year witnessed a landmark decision by WCAI to pay its players rupees 1,000 for one-day internationals and rupees 2,000 for test matches. Although the remuneration pales in comparison to what the men were paid, it was a positive start nevertheless. The transformative steps were taken thanks to Women's Cricket Association of India General Secretary Anuradha Dutt. Rangaswamy credits Dutt and Shubhangi Kulkarni, a former international cricketer herself, for transforming WCAI and reviving women's cricket by the turn of 21st century. While women's cricket was back on a steady path by the mid-1990s, the damage done to the sport for more than a decade in the 80s and early 90s remained quite significant. So in my dissertation, now this is some comparison between how the perception had also changed. In 1973. There was a lot of optimism regarding how women's cricket is improving, is progressing. But by 1992, there was a lot of pessimism. There was a lot of disappointment in the condition of the sport as well. But after 1991, there was a path of recovery. And if you follow the current, the contemporary developments, in after 2017, there has been a lot of progress in women's cricket in India. By the advent of WPL in 2022, it has taken significant strides. But the momentum that was lost during the 70s, after this 80s period, 80s to 90s period, remain still a problem in women's cricket in India. So this is where I stop this presentation. I did a lot more in my thesis, but I don't think I have time to elaborate on that. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ashish, for a really rich presentation in terms of exploring what has been a little bit of an invisible history in terms of women's involvement in cricket in India. So thank you very much. I'll open it out to questions, but please put your hand up or put questions in the chat. I'm just going to stop the recording. And while people are thinking of questions,